What's up, everybody? Welcome to the video. It's Ryan here, former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, and airline pilot flying the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. This is now day 5 in a row of U.S. strikes on Iran, and the target group that has shown up night after night in every single CENTCOM statement this week is command centers, the actual brain of Iran's military system, the facilities that let their leaders sit the battlefield and give orders to forces spread across the whole country. Take that out again and again, and you're not just destroying hardware, you're hurting Iran's ability to coordinate anything at all. Let's break down exactly what's been hit, why targeting command and control is such a different kind of strike than going after a radar site or a missile launcher, and where this is heading as strikes are now getting closer to Tehran than at any other point in this specific round of the war. I'm going to walk through this week's pattern of command center strikes and what CENTCOM has actually confirmed, then explain what a facility like Qatam al-Anbiya actually is and why hitting Iran's command structure matters so much more than hitting any single weapon system, then cover the new casualty numbers and the strikes now landing near the capital for the first time in this round, then Iran's warning about what happens if this spreads further, then a small but truly notable diplomatic detail buried in the middle of all this, and finish with my take on what degrading a country's command and control actually does to its ability to keep fighting. CENTCOM's own statements this week have been remarkably consistent in their wording. And that consistency tells you something important. Night after night, the language keeps repeating. U.S. forces struck Iranian command centers, air defense sites, missile and drone capabilities, and coastal surveillance facilities. On Wednesday specifically, CENTCOM confirmed it had completed an evening wave hitting exactly that target set using precision munitions across multiple locations, including Bandar Abbas, and separately confirmed an earlier 90-minute strike that morning against coastal, defense and cruise missile sites on Greater Tumb Island, a small but strategically important island near the strait believed to house a naval base Iran has used to help disrupt shipping in that corridor. By early Thursday, CENTCOM had done it again, striking several more military sites and assets, specifically described as an effort to further degrade Iran's ability to threaten mariners moving through the strait. And this time, the strikes reached farther north and closer to the capital than at any point in this particular wave of the war. CENTCOM also confirmed something new in this round. They disabled an oil tanker directly in the strait itself as part of these operations, which is a notable shift. Up to this point, most of the tanker attacks in this war have come from Iran's side. This is the U.S. directly stopping a vessel as part of its own operations. I want to explain why command centers specifically are such a valuable target group, because it's a different kind of strategic logic than hitting a missile site or a radar installation. Iran's overall military structure runs through a unified joint headquarters called Qatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, based in Tehran and operating directly under the country's general staff. This is the facility responsible for planning and coordinating joint operations across all of Iran's different military branches, the regular army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the IRGC all at once. Think of it as the actual coordinating brain that takes strategic decisions from Iran's top leadership and turns them into real operational orders that get sent out to units in the field. That's exactly why targeting facilities like this carries a different kind of strategic weight than destroying one weapon system. If you take out a single missile battery, Iran loses that specific capability at that specific location, but the rest of their military can still function normally, still receive orders, still coordinate a response. If you steadily degrade the actual command and control infrastructure that lets leaders see what's happening across the battlefield and give coordinated orders in response, you start to break apart the military's ability to operate as one unified force at all. Individual units might still be able to fight locally, but the bigger coordination that lets a modern military respond smartly to a fast-moving multi-front situation like this one starts to break down. This isn't the first time in this war that Iran's command structure has been targeted either. Back in March, during the earliest phase of this conflict, CENTCOM confirmed a large-scale strike that destroyed the IRGC's own headquarters, with the command describing the action at the time as cutting off the head of the snake. Israeli forces carried out parallel strikes during that same period against dozens of other Iranian command centers, including intelligence headquarters, IRGC Air Force command facilities, and internal security headquarters, degrading what officials at the time called Iran's command and control capabilities across the board. So this week's pattern of hitting command centers night after night is not a brand new strategy. It's a continuation and strengthening of an approach this campaign has leaned on since the very earliest days of the war. And the fact that it is still a primary target group 5 months later tells you Iran has likely been working the whole time to rebuild and restore whatever command infrastructure it can. The casualty figures from this specific wave, covering the period since CENTCOM strikes on Iranian port cities near the strait began last Wednesday, are now up to at least 35 people killed and more than 300 wounded, according to Iranian officials. As I've noted in my other videos on this war, these are figures reported through Iranian channels rather than independently verified by outside sources, but they are specific enough and consistent enough with the scale of this campaign that they are worth taking seriously as a real sign of the human toll here, even without full outside confirmation. On the Iranian side, retaliation has continued in the same pattern we've seen throughout this latest round. The IRGC says it has targeted U.S. military assets in neighboring Gulf countries, and Iranian state media has reported explosions across a truly wide geographic spread this week. Bandar Abbas, Qashm Island, Sirik, Jask, Chabahar, Konarak, Rask, and notably also Khorramabad and Semnan, both of which sit well inland. More evidence that this war's geographic footprint keeps expanding beyond the immediate coastal strip along the strait. Here's a detail I think deserves real attention. Early Thursday local time, air defenses were activated in parts of Tehran itself, and a resident told CNN they were woken up by a loud explosion in the capital. That's a meaningful escalation marker. Throughout most of this specific round of strikes, the fighting has stayed concentrated along the southern coast, the strait itself, and nearby provinces. Air defenses activating in the actual capital, even without confirmation yet of exactly what caused that activation, signals this latest wave is reaching farther into the country's core than the earlier nights of this round did. A spokesperson for the Qatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, that same unified command structure I just explained, issued a pointed public warning this week. They said that if what they called the empty-headed threats from the U.S. actually turn into strikes against Iran's key infrastructure, Tehran would respond by unleashing widespread military attacks across the entire region. That statement lines up directly with everything I covered in my last video about Trump's clear threat to expand strikes into power plants and bridges starting this coming week if Iran does not return to negotiations. So you've got the exact facility responsible for coordinating Iran's overall military response, publicly promising a much broader region-wide retaliations, specifically if that infrastructure threat gets carried out, which tells you Iran's own military leadership is taking that specific threat extremely seriously and is trying to raise the stakes ahead of time before it even happens. I want to include one more detail because I think it's truly notable given how dark most of this update has been. In the middle of all this, Trump announced that Iran released an American woman who had been detained since December of 2024, and he publicly praised it as a gesture of goodwill from Tehran. That's a real, concrete, positive development, landing in the exact same 48-hour window as 5 straight nights of strikes, air defenses activating over the capital, and a warning about region-wide retaliation. At the same time, Iran's own foreign ministry spokesperson said this week that the country currently has no plans for negotiations with the U.S., so it's not as if this release signals an immediate diplomatic breakthrough, but a humanitarian gesture like that happening at all in the middle of an active escalating shooting war tells you there is still some working channel of communication and goodwill between these two governments underneath all the public hostility, which is worth holding on to as a small counterweight to everything else in this update. I want to spend a minute on the actual military doctrine behind this because it's not unique to this war. Targeting an adversary's command and control system early and consistently is a basic principle in modern air campaign planning, and understanding why helps explain a lot of what we are watching unfold night after night in this conflict. In military planning circles, this idea often gets discussed using something called the UDA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. A framework for how any organization, military or otherwise, processes information and responds to a changing situation. A working command structure lets a military complete that loop quickly. Sensors and units in the field observe a threat. Headquarters orients that information against the broader picture. Leadership decides on a response, and orders get pushed back out to units to act, all in a tight coordinated cycle. Degrade or destroy the facilities where that orientation and decision-making actually happens, and you don't just slow that loop down. In a lot of cases, you break it completely. Individual units can still observe threats around them and still act locally. But without a functioning headquarters translating scattered observations into a clear picture and coordinated orders, you end up with a military that is reduced to fighting in isolated pockets rather than as one coordinated force. That's exactly why an air campaign will usually prioritize command and control facilities alongside air defenses in its opening phases before moving on to other target groups. Because a military that cannot see the battlefield clearly or coordinate a response is far less able to effectively defend anything else you might want to strike afterward, including all those other target groups. Missile sites, naval facilities, radar installations that we've covered extensively in my other videos on this war. There is real historical precedent for exactly this kind of campaign, and it's worth understanding. During the opening phase of the First Gulf War, coalition planners built what is sometimes referred to as a strategic paralysis campaign, specifically targeting Iraqi command and control nodes, communications infrastructure, and leadership facilities in the earliest hours of the air campaign, well before moving into sustained strikes against fielded military units. The logic was clear at the time. A paralyzed command structure would leave Iraqi forces in the field unable to respond in a coordinated way to whatever came next. And that approach proved remarkably effective at reducing organized Iraqi resistance far faster than a campaign focused purely on attrition would have. A similar logic drove NATO's air campaign against Serbia in 1999, where Allied planners specifically targeted Yugoslav command and control and leadership infrastructure in Belgrade itself, based on the assessment that a modern, technologically advanced military campaign against a smaller regional power benefits enormously from disrupting the adversary's ability to coordinate, no matter how much raw combat power that adversary might still keep on paper. Both of those historical examples support the same basic idea we're watching play out against Iran right now. Sustained pressure on command and control facilities is not a side effort running next to the main campaign. In a lot of modern military doctrine, it functions as one of the actual keys to making every other part of that campaign more effective. I also want to address an obvious question this whole update raises. If Iran's IRGC headquarters was already destroyed back in March, and command centers have been a consistent target group ever since, why is this still a meaningful target group 5 months later? The honest answer is that modern militaries, even ones taking sustained damage, do not simply stop functioning after one headquarters gets destroyed. They adapt, spread out, and rebuild, often deliberately distributing command functions across multiple, smaller, less obvious facilities, specifically to reduce the risk of losing all coordination ability to any single strike. That is almost certainly part of what has been happening inside Iran over these past 5 months, a continuous effort to rebuild at least some working command and control ability, likely spread across more numerous, smaller, and harder to identify facilities than the one major headquarters that got hit in the opening days of this war. That is exactly why this specific target group keeps showing up night after night in CENTCOM's own statements. Rather than being treated as a box that got checked back in March and never needed to be revisited, degrading a distributed, adaptive command network is not a one-time achievement. It is a sustained campaign that requires continuous intelligence gathering to identify where rebuilt capability is actually located, followed by continuous strikes to keep degrading it faster than it can be rebuilt. The fact that this remains one of the most consistently repeated target groups in every CENTCOM statement across this entire war tells you that cat-and-mouse game between Iranian rebuilding efforts and American targeting is still very much ongoing 5 months in. I also want to explain the Greater Tumb Island strike a little more, because it is a detail that is easy to skim past, but actually connects directly to the broader command and control story. That island sits right near the Strait of Hormuz and is believed to house a naval base, though many of the specific details about what is actually stationed there are not publicly available. What is understood is that it has been used as one of the points from which Iranian forces have disrupted shipping routes through the strait, meaning it likely functions as a forward, localized node that can act somewhat independently, even if broader coordination from Tehran gets disrupted. That is exactly the kind of target that becomes more important, not less, as a broader command and control degradation campaign continues. If Iran's central coordination ability is being systematically weakened, forward-positioned, semi-independent nodes, like whatever is stationed on Greater Tumb Island, become an increasingly important part of Iran's remaining ability to actually threaten shipping in that specific corridor, precisely because they do not need to wait for orders from a damaged central command structure to act locally. Hitting that island specifically in the same 90-minute window as the broader command center strikes elsewhere fits into one clear overall picture: degrade the central brain, and at the same time take out the forward-positioned nodes that could otherwise keep operating semi-independently, even if that central coordination breaks down. All right, here's where I land on this one. Out of every strategic threat I've tracked across this entire war, the sustained focus on command and control targets is honestly the one I think matters most for how this conflict actually ends, more than any single dramatic strike on a bridge or a power plant. A military that loses its ability to coordinate effectively, even if individual units and individual weapon systems remain intact, becomes steadily less capable of mounting anything beyond scattered, locally improvised responses. That is a much harder thing to picture in one dramatic headline than a bridge collapsing or a power plant going dark. But over 5 months of this war, I think it has actually been one of the most important and consistent lines of effort throughout the entire campaign, starting with that IRGC headquarters strike back in March, and continuing right through this week's repeated hits on command centers alongside every other target group. I also think the timing of Khatam al-Anbiya's own warning is worth thinking about. Having the actual coordinating command structure of Iran's military publicly threaten region-wide retaliation specifically tied to the infrastructure escalation Trump described tells you Iran's military leadership sees that threshold moving from military targets into deliberate power plant and bridge targeting as a truly different kind of escalation, one serious enough to justify a public warning ahead of time rather than simply waiting to respond afterward the way they have with every other strike wave up to this point. And I think the American detainee release is a reminder worth ending on. Even in a war defined by nightly strikes, expanding target lists, and increasingly personal rhetoric between two heads of state, there is apparently still enough of a working relationship somewhere beneath the surface for a humanitarian gesture like that to actually happen. That does not mean this war is close to ending. Iran's own foreign ministry made clear this week that negotiations are not currently on the table, but it does suggest the door has not been fully welded shut either, which matters a lot given how close we appear to be to the infrastructure escalation threshold Trump laid out just days ago. So that's where things stand. 5 straight nights of strikes, specifically targeting Iran's command and control infrastructure alongside air defenses, missile sites, and coastal facilities. Strikes now reaching close enough to Tehran to trigger air defense activation in the capital itself. A casualty toll that has climbed past 35 killed and 300 wounded. A direct warning from Iran's own unified command structure about region-wide retaliation if the infrastructure threat becomes real. And in the middle of all of it, a real humanitarian gesture with an American detainee coming home. I'll keep tracking this closely, especially as we move into the week Trump specifically pointed to for a possible expansion into power plants and bridges. What do you think? Does systematically taking apart a country's command and control matter more in the long run than hitting any single high-profile target? Or is this just one part of a much bigger picture? Let me know in the comments below. I read every one. If these breakdowns are helping you really understand the strategy behind what's happening, not just the headlines, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. It helps me keep bringing you this kind of analysis as fast as the war keeps developing. Check out the next video right here. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.